Thank you for joining me. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the way in which the government and the United States resolved the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession. And I should editorialize here at the start by saying that the way that it was done was actually very ethically dubious, and a lot of people were critical and disagreed, including myself. I think that it was an ethically dangerous and dubious precedent to set. At any rate, in 2008, the United States and ultimately the world, the United States dragged the world into the Great Recession. The United States found itself in a very difficult situation. When consumers stop spending, it causes the demand to dry up and causes a large number of businesses to lose revenue. Large number of businesses began defaulting on loans. This created in turn a kind of a snowball effect around the economy, creating chaos and causing many banks and other financial institutions themselves to begin to come precariously close to folding, and a few actually folded, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers being the most famous examples. The government found itself in a difficult situation. In 2008, the government realized that the economy was grinding, it was slowing down dramatically. And this was because, again, on the demand side, consumer demand had dried up. People were trying to save more, they weren't spending as much, and the government wanted to incentivize spending to increase economic output again. What the government settled on was a series of bailouts, and by that I mean recapitalizations, loans, in some cases grants to industries, including especially the financial industry, which were very hard hit by the Great Recession. And the government provided extensive financing to these industries at very favorable terms that turned the government, yes, a minimal profit, but that were much better than these industries, the banks and companies in these industries would otherwise have been able to obtain if they had operated on their own in the absence of government assistance. And the government did this, providing very favorable financing and liquidity so that these banks and companies could continue their operations. The government did this so as to bring stability to the economic order. And the way it paid for these loans, the way it financed these loans, was by means of treasury bills, which it borrowed and which it made, in some cases, out of thin air by means of digital currency offering. Okay, the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort in the United States banking system, and the Federal Reserve provided extensive financing partnerships by means of some complex scenarios through the Treasury Department to help bail out banks that had made bad loans. Now, the reason why this was a controversial practice was twofold. Okay, one reason was what might be called the moral hazard criticism. Basically, the government bailed out a bunch of bad actors, bad agents who had engaged in risky behavior. They had run up incredibly reckless kinds of loan books, and the government provided them with assistance in order to be able to navigate their way out of the problems that they'd caused for themselves by means of their reckless lending practices. This is considered ethically dubious. The reason why the government provided this assistance is pretty clear and maybe justifiable. It was so as to promote and preserve the stability of the system. Many of these lenders were very essential financial agents in the operations of the country and the country's financing system, and if they were to have collapsed by means of the loan book decline of the value of their loans, then it's possible that this could have had liquidity reverberations around the economy. Um, when the government sought to bail them out, it did so for the sake of stability. Okay, it knew that they had engaged in reckless behavior. It did the bailout anyway, so that the entirety of the financial system could be stabilized. Now, once more, the reason why this was reckless, why this was ethically dubious, is that when you bail out bad agents, you are incentivizing them to engage in reckless behaviors again. The lesson that seems to have been drummed home in the minds of a lot of financial professionals after the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession was that if you engage in reckless behavior, if you incur private losses in your enterprise, the government will transform them into public losses and socialize the losses, and it will dilute the currency or tax others, borrow heavily in order to bail you out for your reckless behavior. This incentivizes people to engage in the same behaviors again. And actually, over the last 10 to 12 years, I would say out of my personal experience, I'm making this here in 2020, there are numerous instances of businesses that have continued to engage in the same practices as they did prior to the Great Recession, and indeed actually to engage in more of those practices than they ever did leading up to the Great Recession, precisely as a result of government incentives. Now, the second reason why the bailout was controversial, first reason is moral hazard. Second reason why the bailout was controversial is that the government had to borrow an extensive amount of money to do this. It borrowed some from itself by means of a complex process that involves essentially creating digital currency. And it borrowed some from overseas lenders. There are many lenders who own treasury bills, including especially Japan and China, but others as well. And it essentially ran up the federal deficit in a dramatic way, and ultimately the debt. The debt has ballooned dramatically in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and it's many times larger now than it ever was prior to the Great Recession. One day the debt will be paid by means of inflation or by means of actual payments. I think the most likely scenario is some form of hyperinflation. But running up debts in order to bail out bad actors and in order to stabilize the economy is essentially the choice that the government made. It was a short-term solution, and some have called it a Faustian bargain. In his famous book, Faust, Goethe, the German writer, writes of a man who wants a short-term gain in life. He wants short-term benefits. And the devil appears to him. The devil appears to Dr. Faust. And the devil tells him, well, I'm going to give you an opportunity to have all the things you want in the short term if you will give me your soul. I think it's 24 years from now. And he agrees to this bargain. And the devil gives him all sorts of wonderful things now. And he has all the pleasures that he wants at this time. And 24 years later, the devil shows up to claim his soul. And this is precisely the problem that a lot of critics have pointed to in talking about the government's solution in the aftermath of the Great Recession. That basically the criticism again is that the American government, in a time of dire need, to be sure, took a Faustian bargain and sold the future of the country, the children's future, future generations, all that, for the sake of present prosperity as part of the Faustian bargain. At any rate, it has set the country on a very different financial trek and course and adventure than it ever was on prior to the Great Recession. It is an adventure that has involved ballooning deficits and ballooning debt, and it is not yet clear where this venture will end, although I suspect that it will end in some form of hyperinflation so that the government can inflate its way out of its own debt and pay its debts. Hyperinflation has its own problems. It tends to decrease the living standards dramatically of the people who are suffering under it. At any rate, perhaps there is reason for optimism amid all of this. Perhaps there's not. It is a fascinating story that has all sorts of ethical twists and turns, and it's something that is certainly sobering as well and should be kept in mind as we engage in our own lives, in business and in life in general. And it's a story about not taking on too much risk. Just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean you have to do it too. Uh, and I'll talk more about that next time.